Yeah, we work with several ecosystems within the Pheasant Branch Conservancy, from the restoration, doing restoration from the oak savanna on top of Frederick Hill and the prairies wrapped around the flanks of the hill and to the wetlands where we have the stream flowing through. So those would be the three principal ecosystems that we work with. And there are other old growth forest components as well, that are wet forest, or as well as oak, which is slightly drier. We think of animals in terms of the macrofauna, perhaps the deer and the woodchucks and the snakes and things that are larger that we see regularly, and birds. But beneath that, there's a myriad of insects and amphibians and all kinds of other smaller critters that are associated with particular native species. When we don't have those native species, if you think of a cornfield, it's pretty bland, there's not much else there. But as you introduce a native species, each of these species has its own habitat and its own collection of insects and some pollinators and very specific animals and small animals that are nurtured by this natural environment. So when we do restoration, introducing these native species, then we are expanding immensely the possibilities for different birds and insects. And we do know that there are over 200 species of birds that have been observed, both migrants and resident birds. And that's pretty phenomenal for this climate. This is part of the ongoing restoration process. Restoration never ends, goes on forever. So we think we've cleared invasives out, and they come back because the seeds of the invasives that we're working with have long-lasting viability, so they can stay in the ground for 15 years, and then there's some disturbance and they shoot up again. Fires help control a lot of invasives, but it takes many, many years of constant burning, and can work as well then to knock down those invasives that survive, particularly the woody invasives that may kill the structure above the ground, but the root remains alive and then puts out several shoots. We also, unfortunately, have to rely on herbicides. We're using Garlon here today, which is an herbicide that translocates the herbicide down into the root, so it does kill the root structure. But we have to take precautions about making sure that we have the proper equipment and we're using it in a proper way. So it's a very challenging job. It's a wonderful opportunity to educate as well. So we get to ask and talk about this question of why we're out here and what we're doing. And then our volunteers and students come back and later on field trips for further volunteer work, and they see usually progress. We often think of restoration being 2 steps forward and probably at least 1 backwards. We try not to go too backwards. So we can see progress over time. This hill that we're looking at here was a total jungle when we first began the restoration work in 1994. And so we see tremendous progress that's made year after year. Well, the city started acquiring some of the current present-day Pheasant Branch several decades ago, and so there was a little bit of ongoing restoration work. But when the Friends got organized in the early 90s and started a serious restoration program, primarily on the county land to the north, but also working with the city, we began in earnest. 1994 basically is the starting date, and we were facing a lot of jungle of invasives there, and the early photos demonstrate that. And then a lot of that land was in corn land. So we continued to work with local farmers to keep it in corn. We used a heavy dosage of herbicides to knock back the non-native weeds as they would normally in controlling weeds in their corn crops. And then eventually started planting these 100 different species. So it's an ongoing process. People like to think, aha, we got the prairie up there, we got the savanna, it's all over, we can sit back and enjoy it. No, unfortunately it doesn't work that way. I am sufficiently in touch with the ongoing efforts that I know that we've always talked about acquiring additional land, which is very expensive, of course, in an urban fringe as we are working in. And that is just to extend our protection of the watershed, because when you have storms bringing runoff from neighboring areas, particularly as they've been hard surfaced, that does a lot of damage, and it's overtaxes the ability of the watershed itself to control that runoff, and goes right through carrying pollutants and sediments into Lake Mendota and a chain of lakes. So that's a serious concern. We have a very active watershed committee that's not only working with the 500-acre plus tract that's the Conservancy, but also with the entire Pheasant Branch watershed, which starts way out west of the airport and runs through the city. And so to the extent that we can have an impact on controlling the activities in those areas to reduce the runoff and increase the infiltration of the water in those areas, that makes it better for the entire watershed and enhances the Conservancy itself. So I think those are probably the major directions. We will continue strong efforts in education and continue to do the restoration work.